The first time anyone saw her, she was no more than a shadow crouched in the corner of a windowless room, her eyes sunken and unblinking, her skin pale as river-washed stone. The house itself seemed to exhale a darkness of its own, a weight pressing on the chest, a silence that pressed back at every attempt to move. It was on a damp morning, when the fog lay low in the valleys of Osley County, Kentucky, that the world first glimpsed the remnants of a family hidden for generations. The path to the house wound between ancient oaks and pine, the soil soft and treacherous underfoot. Birds avoided the branches, and even the wind seemed hesitant, curling around the structure like a tentative whisper. Inside, the smell was immediate, a mixture of rot sweat and unwashed bodies, thick enough to choke. Shadows clung to the walls, moving with the figures that shuffled across the dirt floor. 6 people lived there, though it was difficult at first to see them as individuals. An elderly woman with eyes like fog, her daughter who bore the stoop of years of fear and labor, and 4 younger women, all emerging from the depths of a generational secrecy too heavy for the world outside to imagine. Their faces were misaligned, jaws pronounced, eyes not meeting yours, but rather searching a horizon only they could see. Their voices were guttural, rough syllables that floated in the stagnant air, incomprehensible yet oddly precise in rhythm. No records existed of their births, no registrations, no traces in any government ledger. It was as if time had skipped them entirely, leaving only the residue of flesh and bone behind. The social workers who first entered described them in muted, horrified whispers. Ghosts more than people, shadows who moved with an eerie synchrony, rocking back and forth in repetitive gestures that suggested rituals of a world unknown. The silence around them was absolute, broken only by the rasping of breath, the scrape of nails on dirt, the occasional guttural sound that might have been a word, or might have been a plea. Outside, the mist thickened, as if the mountains themselves sought to cover the scene, shielding the house from a world that had failed to look closer for decades. Within that darkness, the oldest woman, Martha Bram, attempted to keep intruders at bay. Her refusal was not anger, but something heavier, a protective weight born of fear, shame, and perhaps a strange loyalty to the twisted order she had helped sustain. Yet the smell, the state of decay, and the obvious signs of neglect demanded intervention. What lay beyond the threshold was not simply poverty. It was a lineage folded in on itself, a chain of silence, of unspoken horrors, and of bodies marked by the consequences of generations of abuse and isolation. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The house, so long abandoned by any form of oversight, had become its own world. Walls blackened by time and smoke bore silent witness to acts no outsider could comprehend, while the dirt floor served as a witness to decades of human suffering. Each corner cradled shadows that moved with their own intent, and the air carried a chill that seemed older than memory, seeping into bones and turning breath to frost. Outside, the drizzle turned the path to mud, each step an echo of countless footsteps that had tread the same route, unseen, unheard, their stories erased by secrecy. Inside, the 4 younger women remained motionless at first, seated upon the earthen floor. Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine. They would only later receive names, assigned by authorities who sought to impose order on a reality that defied it. Their eyes, glassy and distant, reflected fragments of a life none of them could fully articulate. When they moved, it was with the grace of someone guided by habit, not intention, as if the world outside did not exist and the intrusion of strangers was a fleeting aberration. Repetitive rocking, Muttered syllables, gestures that might have been greetings or prayers, and hands tracing patterns in the dirt. All were rituals unrecorded, unacknowledged, yet fundamental to the fragile structure of their days. Medical teams later described what they saw as a compounding of generations, facial asymmetry, skeletal irregularities, neurological patterns suggestive of repeated, close blood relations across decades. Cognitive limitations became evident within hours. Speech, rudimentary at best, emerged only in guttural bursts, and even gestures bore the imprint of isolation. Doctors would later call it degeneration by inbreeding, a slow folding of humanity upon itself, and yet in those first hours, no words could capture the unnatural stillness, the oppressive weight of lives lived without witnesses. The matriarch, Eloise Braham, appeared frail yet guarded, a figure who had carried the burdens of secrecy and violence across decades. Her movements were careful, deliberate, shaping a rhythm for the younger women, a structure to the chaos they could not comprehend alone. Martha, her mother, in-law, though elderly and visibly weakened, retained a presence that was commanding, a reminder that control in this world had long been maintained through fear, ritual, and the absolute prohibition of interference. The silence of the house was more than absence of sound. It was a force, a sentience that pushed back at anyone who sought to pierce its veil. For outsiders, the discovery of the Braham house in 1981 was merely the beginning. The Valley of La Rose, already shrouded in Appalachia's mist and mystery, had concealed this secret for decades. Parish records, neighborhood whispers, and fragments of diaries would later reveal the origin of this hidden lineage, tracing back to the 1920s, when William Braham settled in these remote hills. But for that first morning, as the social workers stepped into the house, all that existed was the scent of decay, the unbroken silence, and the four figures who seemed suspended in time, untouched by the world beyond the trees. It was the kind of horror that did not announce itself with screams, but with absence, the absence of sound, of records, of identity. And yet, beneath that absence, the imprint of generations pressed heavy, shaping faces, shaping minds, shaping the fragile humanity that remained in Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine. Each second of observation revealed more questions than answers, and even the most seasoned of officials felt the weight of a history that had been deliberately hidden, a darkness older than memory itself. Owsley County had always been a land apart, its valleys carved deep into the Appalachians, hemmed in by mountains that wore fog like funeral shrouds. Roads turned to mud with the first hint of rain, and winter snow could isolate a family for weeks. Maps rarely marked the minor hollows where these families lingered, and outsiders often assumed that the absence of settlements was merely nature reclaiming its domain. But in these hidden pockets, human lives unfolded according to rhythms dictated not by calendars or law, but by isolation itself, by geography, custom, and fear. In the 1920s, William Braham arrived in La Rose with his family, leaving behind a mining community and the faint traces of a civilization that had already forgotten him. The land he chose was unforgiving, thick woods, rocky ridges, and streams that refused easy crossing. There, he established a home that was at once sanctuary and prison, a place to shelter his bloodline from the judgment of the world. Villagers who lived miles away spoke of him in low tones, recalling a man whose gaze carried both cunning and cruelty, whose voice was a warning to anyone who approached too closely. The mountains themselves seemed to recognize his presence, bending the wind and the fog around the house as if acknowledging the weight of what occurred within. Eloise, born in 1932, grew up in these shadows, the daughter of William and his second cousin Sally, whose own health was fragile. Her speech slurred and gestures uncertain. By the time she was 12, she had learned the rules of the house, the boundaries of her body, of her thoughts, of what must never be spoken aloud. There were no teachers beyond the mountains, no midwives beyond those who obeyed William's commands, and no neighbors bold enough to question the rhythms of this household. The child learned quickly that silence was survival, that obedience was not merely expected, but demanded by generations of fear and secrecy. By 13, Eloise's body had begun a cycle that would ripple across decades. The first pregnancy arrived quietly, without midwives who understood the full horror, without records, without witnesses. It was the beginning of a lineage marked not by names or dates, but by the imprint of blood folded in on itself. For the mountains, for the house, for the figures who moved in shadows, this was simply existence. The community, beyond the trees, glimpsed hints of the abnormal, whispers of strange cries in the night, of children who looked older than they should, or spoke in strange guttural patterns, but no one ventured close enough to confirm the stories. In La Rose, rumor was a fragile shield against curiosity, and silence a weapon sharper than any blade. The geography itself contributed to the horror. Steep cliffs and winding streams isolated the Braham property from the rest of Osli County. Mail arrived sporadically, supplies were limited, and winter storms often rendered travel impossible. In this isolation, patterns of abuse, neglect, and inbreeding could persist unbroken, passed silently from parent to child, sibling to sibling, folded generation upon generation. It was not only the will of William Braham that allowed such acts. It was the land, the culture, the forgotten institutions of the county that permitted the cycle to continue, invisible, unchallenged. In the shadows of La Rose, history became physical. Faces carried the map of past sins. Bones, once young, bore the strain of generations. The world outside could not touch them, and in the silence, the house, the family, and the mountains conspired to hide what should never have been born. Each step, each breath within those walls was measured against a legacy that neither mercy nor time could erase. The first cries of the children went unnoticed by the world beyond the house. Born in shadows, they were never recorded, never baptized, never held in the gaze of strangers. Agnes, the eldest, came into the dim light of the house in 1951, followed by Mary Louise, and finally Catherine in 1963. Each was a product of the twisted lineage carefully guarded by William Braham and his sons, the cycles of blood repeating themselves with the precision of a curse. From birth, the girls were trained to live within the rhythms of the household, to eat when told, to move as instructed, to keep their voices low, their desires unspoken. Their days were measured by silence and ritual. By morning, the shadows of the house seemed to stretch across the dirt floor, urging them into patterns, rocking, tracing shapes with fingers in dust, murmuring the few sounds they had been permitted. Their bodies bore signs of repeated endogamy, misaligned jaws, distorted limbs, eyes that never fully met another's gaze. Yet within the limits of their deformities, each girl displayed a strange awareness of the other, a preternatural knowledge that connected them in ways outsiders could not comprehend. They existed simultaneously as daughters, sisters, and cousins in a tangled web, a living testament to decades of isolation and secrecy. Visitors, when they ever came, were rare and fleeting. Midwives, parish officials, or wandering neighbors were met with suspicion, fear, or outright hostility. Eloise moved among the girls like a shadow, correcting their movements, monitoring their speech. maintaining the fragile order of the household. Martha, the grandmother, lingered in corners, her presence heavy with silence, a warning that the world beyond the house was a threat, and that inside, the rules of blood and obedience reigned supreme. The psychological effects were profound. The girls seemed older than their years, carrying the weight of ancestral secrets in their movements, their mutterings, their occasional gazes at the misted windows. Yet they were also trapped in a perpetual childlike state, unaware of their own deformities. Their voices limited to guttural sounds, their minds shaped entirely by the cycles of the household. Objects were assigned ritual significance: a cracked teacup, a piece of string, an old wooden chair. Each item became a token, a symbol, a fragment of the structure that allowed them to exist without collapse. Outside, the community whispered of strange cries at night, of shadows glimpsed from the ridges above the house. A dog barking once, then gone, the scent of smoke without fire, small footprints leading nowhere. Few dared approach, and those who did left quickly, eyes averted, hearts pounding. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire with the household, masking the presence of the girls and the twisted lineage that had produced them. It was a life without innocence, yet not entirely conscious of corruption. The Bram girls grew with an unnatural rhythm, their bodies and minds reflecting generations of secrecy, abuse, and isolation. In the small hours of the night, the rocking of their bodies echoed against the walls, a cadence older than the mountains themselves. Within that cadence was the memory of every act of control, every forbidden birth, every silence that had stretched across decades. By the time the girls reached adolescence, the house had become a labyrinth of shadows and half-lit corners, each space haunted by memories no one dared speak aloud. The walls themselves seemed etched with the residue of past lives, scratches in the wood, faint stains in the dirt, impressions of bodies that had pressed against them in fear or habit. Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine moved through these spaces as if guided by some ancient rhythm, their hands tracing invisible lines, their feet stepping in patterns known only to them. Repetitive gestures became rituals, rocking back and forth, murmuring syllables of unknown meaning, arranging stones and twigs into shapes on the dirt floor. At night, strange sounds rose from the house, whispered chants, cries muffled by blankets, and low, guttural voices that did not belong to the children alone. Eloise, their mother and keeper, moved among them with careful precision, enforcing silence when necessary, guiding rituals that outsiders could not understand, marking the boundaries of what could be seen and what must remain hidden. Martha's presence was quieter, but no less potent. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, measured every movement, every whisper, every act of defiance. Within the house, the normal rhythms of childhood, play, laughter, curiosity, were replaced with a strict adherence to patterns born of isolation, secrecy, and inherited trauma. Animals sometimes appeared at the edges of the property, drawn by the faint scent of life, only to vanish mysteriously. Dead birds, small rodents, and other creatures were discovered at the threshold of the house or arranged in the yard. Their placement deliberate, symbolic, or perhaps the work of minds too young to understand the consequences. Their presence was a warning to any who might come too close. The Bram family belonged to the land, the mountains, and the shadows that pressed against them. The girls' behaviors were often unsettling. Conversations, when they occurred, were a tangle of words, sounds, and gestures. They would respond to questions only partially, sometimes speaking in voices that seemed older than their bodies, sometimes remaining utterly silent. Their eyes held a depth that unnerved anyone who dared to meet them, an awareness of generations of abuse, of knowledge too terrible for words, of histories folded in on themselves. It was as if the house itself had taught them a language, one composed of rhythm, repetition, and the cadence of survival. Letters and parcels occasionally arrived from the outside world, though they were infrequent and often ignored. The postal worker remembered a house where mail was delivered, but no one ever signed for it. Government agents occasionally appeared, leaving notices, forms, or questions unanswered. The house absorbed these intrusions into its silence, as though the walls themselves swallowed the evidence, ensuring that no record would ever remain. The psychological landscape of the Braham girls mirrored the physical decay around them. Faces bore the marks of close kinship, repeated for generations. Limbs were misaligned, movements awkward, speech fragmented. Yet beneath this physical manifestation of isolation lay something darker, a certainty that their world was closed, self-contained, and absolute. Outsiders were not merely unwelcome, they were a threat, intrusions into a carefully orchestrated reality that had persisted for decades, unseen and unchallenged. The truth, when it emerged, was more grotesque than anyone could have imagined. The Braham family had not merely been isolated. It had been folded inward, generation after generation, like a map pressed too tightly against itself. Eloise, their mother, had been the daughter of William Braham, a man whose shadow fell across the property long before the girls were born. By the 1940s, whispers suggest he had begun the cycle of abuse that would echo for decades, a web spun in silence, with no witnesses to intervene, no records to bind him. Each birth that followed was not merely a child, but a layering of kinship twisted into itself, siblings, cousins, daughters, and mothers overlapping in ways the outside world could scarcely comprehend. Agnes, the eldest, was born of this folding of blood. Her existence, along with her sisters Mary, Louise, and Catherine, was the culmination of decades of secrecy, abuse, and repeated endogamy. Each girl was simultaneously a sister, a cousin, and a daughter, a living embodiment of what the mountains had protected, and the world had failed to see. Medical reports later described physical traits that reflected generations of consanguinity, misaligned jaws, prominent foreheads, neurological patterns suggestive of both trauma and genetic inheritance, and bodies etched with the slow accumulation of recessive disorders. In the quiet hours of the night, the rituals continued, but now their significance became clearer. The repetitive movements, the murmured syllables, the careful placement of objects. They were the echoes of a lineage attempting to assert itself, to find structure in a world that had denied them clarity. Within the dirt, flawed rooms, the girls acted out the rhythms of the past, unaware of the full horror of their origins, yet bound inexorably to the acts that had created them. The local community, distant and fearful, had long sensed that something was wrong, but the depth of the transgression remained invisible. Church records, parish notes, and the few surviving diaries revealed faint clues, a pastor noting concern over the improper union of cousins, a midwife recording the birth of a 13-year-old child, neighbors speaking in whispers of children who seemed older than their years, and adults who never left the property. These fragments, scattered across decades, slowly formed the outlines of the Braham web, a family tree folded in upon itself, so tightly that its branches became impossible to untangle. Even when authorities arrived in 1981, the reality was almost impossible to grasp. The four sisters moved with the certainty of those who had known only their house, their patterns, their family. Their mother, Eloise, and grandmother, Martha, offered fragments of truth, obscured by memory, fear, and cognitive trauma. Yet the pattern was undeniable. The property, the family, and the mountains themselves had preserved a cycle of abuse, secrecy, and genetic collapse that was older than anyone alive at the time of discovery. In these revelations, horror was not just in what had been done, but in what had been allowed to persist. The Braham lineage was not merely a crime against individuals. It was a testament to decades of neglect, silence, and cultural isolation, a history etched in bone, flesh, and the minds of children who had known nothing else. The mountains held their secret for nearly half a century, and when that secret emerged, it was already too late to reverse the damage. When the authorities finally understood the magnitude of what lay hidden in the house at La Rose, the valley itself seemed to recoil. Neighbors spoke in hurried whispers, some claiming they had suspected, others swearing they had never known. The house, already darkened by decades of neglect, became a symbol of shame, a site where the normal rules of community and morality had failed entirely. Church leaders convened quietly, debating how to confront a horror that had persisted unnoticed for decades, while the county's social services struggled to impose the authority of the state upon a history that had long existed beyond its reach. The immediate response was containment. Eloise and Martha were taken into custody, though Martha would die within weeks, her body unable to withstand the decades of malnutrition, cold, and neglect. The four sisters were moved to a state-run institution, their isolation replaced with structured care, doctors, and the first glimpses of education they had ever known. For them, the walls of the house had been both prison and world. Now the walls of the institution became protective, yet alien, boundaries. Even in these safer spaces, the weight of the past remained, their movements, their gestures, the strange cadence of their speech, all carried the imprint of generations, trapped in silence and ritual. The town of Osely County grappled with a mix of fear, shame, and disbelief. Families who had once walked the same ridges, as the Brahams realized that the mountains had shielded not just a family, but a secret that implicated the community itself. For decades, neighbors had turned away, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect for what they called mountain privacy. Now, the consequences of that silence could not be ignored. Some advocated for violence, burning the house, destroying property, erasing evidence, but the state intervened before the anger could manifest fully. Still, the echoes of collective complicity lingered, haunting conversations in dimly lit homes and at church gatherings long after the first discovery. Official records, diaries, and parish notes were gathered in an attempt to reconstruct the Braham genealogy. Investigators traced the cycle of incest back through William Braham, his sons, and the isolated marriages of cousins. The pattern was chilling. Each generation perpetuated the abuse of the last, each child born carrying the genetic consequences of secrecy and isolation. Social services and medical professionals struggled to comprehend the scale of neglect and abuse, recognizing that the valley had acted as both shield and accomplice, protecting the family from intervention for decades. Even as the state assumed control over the girls' lives, the broader implications of the case pressed against the edges of society. Questions arose. How could a family live for decades in such conditions, without birth certificates, without records, without legal oversight? How had institutions failed to intervene? The Braham case forced a reckoning in Osely County, prompting reforms in child welfare, social service protocols, and oversight of remote communities. Yet, for those who had lived through the discovery, the memory of the house. The smell, the silence, the rocking figures in the dark remained indelible, a reminder of what could fester when fear and isolation held sway. The valley returned to its fog and its quiet, but the shadow of the Braham house lingered. Bones, patterns, and stories could not be erased. The legacy of abuse, neglect, and inbreeding became a cautionary tale, a record that would shape policy, research, and collective memory. And in the corners of the mountains, where the wind carried the scent of damp earth and rot, the story persisted, whispered to those who might listen. By the early 1980s, the state of Kentucky had begun to treat the Braham case not merely as a local scandal, but as a subject of medical, anthropological, and social inquiry. Researchers from the University of Kentucky arrived in Osley County with notebooks, cameras, and medical instruments, walking the same misted paths that had once shielded the family for decades. They found parish records, fragments of diaries, and faded photographs, shards of memory that traced the Braham lineage back to William and his second cousin Sally, to a time when the valley had been a place of secrecy, not scandal. Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, observed the four sisters with a careful, clinical gaze, recording anomalies in facial structure, bone alignment, and neurological development. The sisters, now removed from the oppressive rhythms of the house, began slowly to respond to structured care. Agnes and Mary learned to form simple phrases. Louise began small tasks with supervision, and Catherine, the youngest, displayed remarkable adaptability once she received adequate stimulation. Each step forward was measured, deliberate, yet shadowed by the imprint of decades of generational abuse. In archives, researchers found notes that had never been made public. Pastor Jonathan Williams, in 1935, had written of concerns regarding the Brahms, warning of unions that carried too close a bloodline. Midwife Florence Watson, in a diary yellowed with age, recorded births she had attended at the property, including that of a 13-year-old Eloise. Her entries were clinical yet suffused with horror, details of eyes distant, bodies frail, the absence of any father besides William or his sons. These documents became crucial in piecing together a genealogy that the mountains had long hidden, revealing a web of incestuous lineage spanning decades, each generation folding in upon the last. Even the dead testified. In 1982, during road repairs near the Braham property, workers unearthed the remains of two children, buried decades earlier in a swampy hollow. Forensic analysis linked them to Eloise's first two children, who had never been recorded in any official documents. The evidence, skeletal and silent, confirmed the devastating consequences of isolation and abuse: generations lost, lives erased, and bodies left to rest in secrecy. The research did more than trace genetics. It illuminated the failures of society itself. Social workers, postal employees, neighbors, and even church officials had glimpsed fragments of this horror over the decades, and yet few acted, and those who did were blocked by custom, fear, or institutional inertia. The mountains had protected the Braham family, but they had also shielded a crime far larger than the household itself. The crime of omission, the horror of silence maintained by an entire community. As the 1980s progressed, the Braham case became a study in institutional failure and genetic tragedy. Doctors published reports on the cumulative effects of endogamy, while social workers re-evaluated protocols for isolated properties. The girls, once shadows on a dirt floor, began to occupy rooms filled with sunlight, learning rudimentary words, performing small tasks, even creating drawings that captured fragments of their inner worlds. Yet the past remained, etched into faces, bones, and minds, a reminder that some horrors cannot be fully erased, only understood and remembered. The last years of the Bram sisters was spent within walls that offered care, but could never erase the echoes of the house, where they had first learned the rhythms of their existence. Agnes, the eldest, struggled with speech, her thoughts trapped behind the barriers of generations of abuse. Yet she learned small tasks, a fragile autonomy that marked the first true agency of her life. She died in 1997, at 46, her heart weakened by a lifetime her body had never been meant to endure. Mary, the second, discovered the faint light of creativity. Within the quiet of her room, she drew figures, always four women holding hands, always anonymous, always separated from the world that had denied them identity. Her lungs eventually betrayed her, and she passed in 2001 at 47, leaving behind drawings that became silent testimony to the life she had barely known. Louise, considered the most resilient, found a rhythm in simple work, supervised tasks that allowed her to touch the world beyond the walls she had always inhabited. Her life extended to 50, marked by moments of connection, small victories against a legacy of erasure. Catherine, the youngest, achieved the most profound cognitive growth. Removed from the house as a child, her mind adapted to learning, communication, and supervised independence in ways her sisters never could. She was transferred to a group residential setting in 1990, where she lived until 2012, her life quietly threading the fragile line between care and containment. Each sister, in her own way, bore the imprint of history, carrying the evidence of generations of secrecy, abuse, and neglect that had allowed their existence to unfold hidden, unacknowledged, and unrecorded. The Braham house itself, the epicenter of this shadowed history, was demolished in 1990. Nature began to reclaim the land, erasing walls, floors, and doorways that had borne witness to unspeakable acts. Today, only whispers remain in the valley of La Rose, fragments of memory embedded in the mist and the wind through the pines. In 2002, a small memorial was placed in the county cemetery, listing only the names Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine. No dates, no details, only the barest acknowledgement that these lives had existed, survived, and been claimed by history too late to prevent their suffering. The case continues to reverberate through medical and social service communities. Students study the Braham sisters to understand the effects of multigenerational inbreeding. Social workers examine the systemic failures that allowed isolation to mask horror for decades. Laws were changed, protocols implemented, yet the moral weight of the story persists, a testament to what can happen when communities, institutions, and neighbors turn away from the vulnerable. The mountains of Osle County remain silent and indifferent, guarding secrets older than any living witness. Shadows still cling to the hollows, and the wind carries the faint memory of rocking figures, of muttered syllables, of lives lived in the thin space between survival and oblivion. The Braham case is not simply a story of crime or genetics. It is a tale of neglect, of silence, and of human fragility pressed against the weight of isolation. And so, one must ask in the quiet of the mountains, in the hush of the valleys, if the truth of your own family were hidden in shadows for decades, folded upon itself like the branches of the Braham tree, what would you do? Could you bear to see the cycle for what it truly was? Or would you, like so many before, turn away and leave the echoes unanswered?